Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is July 25th, Wednesday, and we are going to talk today about a sort of general overview about this week's crazy astrology. So there's a lot going on this week, which has a lot of people writing to me, asking questions, commenting, and beyond my readership and audience, I see on social media so many of my colleagues and fellow astrologers fielding questions from people saying, what's going to happen? There's this crazy eclipse coming. My God, there's an eclipse with Mars retrograde. Oh my gosh, the sun is square to Uranus. It's opposed to Mars. A Mars, Sun, Uranus T-square. Like, that's intense. Plus this eclipse coming. Plus Venus opposite Neptune. What's going on? So I'll give you a feeling for it. I haven't been able to turn on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at all this week, or my website, or my email inbox, and any of those social media sites without getting a series of questions being like, what's going to happen? What does this all mean? What, and what kind of breakthroughs should we expect? What kind of breakdowns should we expect? And so this morning I had a long conversation with a friend. I sat and talked with a friend of mine who's also an astrologer, not a kind of public profile type of astrologer, but he's a very good astrologer. He's a friend of mine from Hong Kong. And we talked for several hours, as we try to do once a week. So once a week, I try to take time to just have shop talk with a friend. And he's also on the Bhakti Yoga path. And so we talk about yoga as well. He also owns a yoga studio. So it's we have a lot in common. And I actually met him at NORWAC a couple of years ago. He's a really nice guy. Anyway, we had a long talk this morning, and we were just sitting there conversing and going through things. And suddenly we got into this really, deep conversation. And he shared with me a piece of writing. I shared a piece of writing from him about a week ago that was really profound on Facebook. A lot of people liked it. But I'm going to share something to begin today's talk, which I've titled This Week's Crazy Astrology, a Meditation on Real Breakthroughs. I'm going to start off today's talk by taking a look at something that he wrote that really moved me this morning and inspired me to write this talk out for today's video blog. So here's what he wrote. By the dogged pounding of their prose, it would appear some writers think the absence of poetry makes writing more clear. In the case of technical manuals discussing nuts and bolts and which side faces which, yes. But in the case of sublime and subtle matters, such attempts at unambiguous precision blocks from view the very subtlety trying to be conveyed. All writing is meant to point the eye. Nut and bolt writing points the eye to nuts and bolts. Subtle matters and things sublime must be written of in subtle terms. The role of poetry, or little is conveyed. Artful ambiguity, always a risk, teases us to awaken our senses higher. It's a kind of grace which allows us to perceive what prior we had no prompt to look for. The nature of such writing is pure generosity, all of its expression given away. And its telltale sign is that it simply lets you see for yourself. So when he read that to me, I was almost moved to tears because it's such a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. But the context of how that piece of writing came up today is really important. It came up within the context of a conversation that we were having about some topics in astrology. And among those topics was, for example, the question of how to interpret or how to predict what kinds of events are likely to occur when there is so much intense astrology happening. So this is where today's talk comes in. Because I've received so many emails and so many questions from people saying, okay, tell me what's going to happen. How are you interpreting the signs? How are you interpreting these celestial omens right now? It's a crazy week. What does it all mean? What's going to happen? So the question of interpretation is there. What is this? What's going to happen? And prediction as well. What you predict what's going to happen, or you interpret the meaning of why everything is happening the way that it's happening. And astrologers, in a sense, are always at the edge of their own sentences, rushing forward to try and stay ahead of the dissatisfaction of the listener. The dissatisfaction of the listener that says, nah, that's kind of it, but there's something more. Come on, give me more. And I experience this all the time when I do readings for people, when I do these video blogs, when I write every day. My God, I write a daily horoscope. There's something about this that can very easily turn into what my friend calls the dogged pounding of prose. At worst, astrology is a kind of it's a kind of spiritual epidemic. At its worst, it shows a line of people really, kind of waiting to be fed. They're something to quench the insatiable hunger of their anxiety. Just moment after moment after moment after moment of anxiety. And how can the current transits somehow address the anxiety of existence, of just being here and dealing with what's going to happen? What does it all mean? And so I feel oftentimes like I'm a dogged, pounder of prose. You know what I mean? And the real challenge of being an astrologer is the challenge of doing exactly what my friend says. All writing is meant to point the eye. Similarly, all reading, like reading the omens, reading the signs of the planets, all reading is meant to point the eye. Nut and bolt writing points the eyes to nuts and bolts. Similarly, adjectives and descriptions of planets and energies and the cliches and tropes of New Age meaning, you're going to be empowered, you're going to be disempowered, you're a victim, you're not a victim, you're rising up, you're falling down. All of this language sometimes conveys very little. It points to nuts and bolts. And where the real task of the astrologer is to somehow use language and allow the symbols to become alive again. And that's what calls us back at best. At best, astrology in its symbolism is something that invites us to the edge of our existence and to look over into the pool of the soul, its confounding depths, and to say yes to it. And astrology can satisfy us in a sense, at least temporarily, when it's through its symbolism, it opens us up to subtle matters, to sublime matters. And the way that it does that is very, it's a little bit paradoxical, because astrology has to use language that invites us into participate with the meaning and the unfolding of the events in our lives. And that requires a kind of flexibility, a multidimensionality, a perspectival flexibility. But on the other hand, astrology, in order to grant us some kind of flexibility, has to grant us something about which we may become flexible. And that's its predictive power. In predicting things successfully, or even somewhat successfully within a range of possibilities, astrologers are describing something of concrete reality, whether that's an inner event or an outer event. And we're describing it, we're predicting it in advance, as though there is something about our condition that is rather helpless. And so prediction acknowledges the situation of helplessness that we find ourselves in, the basic condition of hitting the brick wall of our lives, of our own behaviors, of our own inner turmoil, of the turmoil of the world. And it can describe that. But by doing so, it grants distance and reflexivity. So by describing accurately the world around us, we may participate with interpretive flexibility. We may come to understand that there are meanings, pools of meaning, rivers of meaning flowing through everything, and they're very multidimensional. But you can't do that without also having some ability to predict or describe the concrete reality to which we are trying to relate. So astrologers are always, we're tasked with a great burden, which is to try and present to people something of an accurate description of what is going to happen, and then hopefully some bridge that one may walk across through the events of destiny, that grants a kind of flexibility to the soul, that grants that admits openly the flexibility of the soul to participate in ways that are multidimensional. And think about that. That's not an easy thing to do. We're trying to convey that through 10-minute video blogs. We're trying to convey that through daily written horoscopes or sun sign columns, or we're trying to do that while trying to learn more astrology ourselves. And we're trying to do it regularly and keep up with the beat of creation, keep up with the dogged pounding of days that we all live, the dogged pounding of anxiety that doesn't go away easily. And so astrologers, I just celebrate astrologers for their own relentlessness. So in the midst of that dogged pounding of prose, there is something admirable. Another way of thinking about it that I've sometimes used is that we circumambulate. We astrologers are orbiting the orbits. We're circumambulating the stars ourselves. We're in our own orbit around changes. And as we circumambulate the changes in the sky, we are reciting the mantras of adjectives. We are chanting adjectives as we circle the stars and hoping that something will land, will both describe what your experience is and grant you some inner access to the experience so that it becomes a soulful experience. You gain that critical distance from the experience, but it's also the keyhole through which the experience becomes soulful. So that's what we're trying to do all the time, and it's very, very challenging. So my friend and I were talking about all of this today, and I was talking about how exhausted I am with trying to field questions that people have. What does this mean? What's going to happen? What does this mean? What's going to happen? So in thinking about that, he read this to me, and he said, he was commenting on what a challenge it is, to try and do astrology in a way that can deliver these kinds of results. Because astrology can frequently deliver results that are half-baked, that don't work. For example, in a week like this week, to me, the failure of astrology would be in describing what's going to happen, but not giving you any access to a soulful experience. On the other hand, another failure would be to suggest that anything can be made of this experience, whatever you wish. And it's here are the different kinds of energies. Now go sort of X-wing fighter pilot, your way through it, and hopefully you can construct some really pleasing result. Either of those don't do it for me personally. So I believe this middle place has something to do with saying there are things that are going to happen, much of which may be out of your control. But it turns out that these things that are going to happen also become the space in which you can cultivate a soulful relationship to the other. And that's profound. That is, in a sense, what I want to talk about today in terms of what a real breakthrough looks like. So this is all in the spirit, by the way, of Sun Square Uranus. You could say that this entire talk is an attempt to, in some ways, be subtle and sublime about the Sun Square Uranus, which is very present right now. So at any rate, for those who are interested in a little meta level of conversation there. But let's break down the Sun Uranus as just one example of the different kinds of transits taking place this week. But let's break it down for the sake of demonstrating that any transit ultimately has the same spiritual value, the same spiritual purpose. Any transit can provide us with the same kind of breakthrough. So let's start with a description of the sun. I have a bunch of books here today. So let's start with the description of the sun. This comes from the Anthology of Vettius Valens of Antioch. This is from the first book of his anthology, concerning the nature of the stars. Listen to what he says here about the sun, which is square to Uranus this week as the eclipse is coming through, as an opposition to Mars is happening. The moon in its eclipse will be square to Uranus. The sun, or the Mars, is also in a square to Uranus. So here's the sun, starting by looking at the sun Uranus here this week. The all-seeing sun, then, being truly fire-like and the light of the mind, the organ of perception of the soul, is significant at birth for, and then he gives a long list of things: leadership, judgment, father, mastership, persons of high repute, the honors of images, statues, crowns of office, archpriests of the fatherland, etc., etc. But notice the first two parts. Truly fire-like and the light of the mind, the organ of perception of the soul. The light of the mind, the organ of perception of the soul. Remember that in ancient times, the philosophy worked a little bit like this. Your body has formed around your consciousness. So you are not your body, but your body is something that has congealed in the material world around your consciousness, your soul. And close to your soul on a level that's sort of more abstract is your mind. And your mind, a step below that, are your senses. And then you kind of go down, and then eventually you get to the gross physical body. But the mind, what's in the mind, has the ability to reflect back the light of the soul, the light of pure consciousness. So what we fill our mind with is very, very important. And the ability of the mind to have real or true insight into the way that things are generally means that the mind is perceiving through the gross material form a subtler and higher reality that is closer to the nature of the spirit soul, which participates in a spiritual or divine realm. Remember, a lot of these astrologers are highly influenced by Platonism, by Indian philosophy, etc. So when Vettius Valens says that the sun is the light of the mind, the organ of perception of the soul, he starts with that esoteric teaching, and then goes on to say, and it can represent kings and all of the different things in the world. He is embodying, in the way that he's teaching us about the sun, the hierarchy of values, spiritually speaking, that ancient astrologers had. That the mind is the organ of perception for the soul, and that the sun as a symbol represents that mind. And then when you disseminate further down to there in gross forms, you get different things that kind of represent that. For example, a king. What is a king? A king is sort of like the mind of civilization in an ideal sense. We're not talking, there's lots of tyrants and so forth, but a king or a queen in an ideal sense is the central organizing principle. And it holds everything together, and it allows for some sense of unity. And through the leader, we are thought to perceive the truth. This is why kings and queens long ago, and emperors and empresses and so forth, were considered to be sort of incarnations of God. So the comparison between a king and the mind is similar for that reason. It's a similar idea. But what does that mean in terms of a Sun-Uranus square? It means that there's an opportunity, especially when we talk about Uranus in a moment, to have a breakthrough of insight, to have some kind of true glimpse, or to have some sense of a higher reality within the mundane or within the gross and physical, that it can become a conduit through which we perceive subtler realities or higher truths. Again, this is a part of a philosophical tradition that was very similar to Platonism, among other philosophies. Now let's talk about Uranus, which the sun is squaring. Here's Richard Tarnas from Cosmos and Psyche, brilliant book. He says this: the planet Uranus is empirically associated with the principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation, reform and revolution, and the unexpected breakup of structures. With sudden surprises, revelations and awakenings, lightning-like flashes of insight, the acceleration of thoughts and events, with births and new beginnings of all kinds, and with intellectual brilliance, cultural innovation, technological invention, experiment, creativity, and originality. In addition to the occurrence of sudden breakthroughs and liberating events, Uranus transits are linked to unpredictable and disruptive changes. Hence, the planet is often referred to as the cosmic trickster. Another set of themes associated with Uranus is a concern with the celestial and the cosmic, with astronomy and astrology, with science and esoteric knowledge, and with space travel and aviation. With respect to personal character, Uranus is regarded as signifying the rebel, the innovator, the awakener, the individualist, the dissident, the eccentric, the restless, and wayward. Okay, so you get a sense of a feeling for Uranus. So when you combine the sun, the organ of perception, the mind, the organ of perception of the soul, with Uranus, you have the potential for a kind of radical breakthrough moment where you understand something, or you see something more completely, or you're able to access a more subtle realm of awareness. That's a typical Sun-Uranus description that is not going to be, it's more on the subtle plane. So if you were to interpret Uranus and the sun on the gross level, you could say things like challenges to authority figures. The sun, authority figure; Uranus, the rebel. You could say something like your father is having a sudden health episode. Father, son, Uranus, disruptive, sudden, shocking event. The sun as heart, Uranus as square. You could say a heart attack. Okay, well, for example, in the news this past week, if you follow the news at all, there was a very famous NFL coach that just died of a heart attack, right as Uranus and the sun get together. Very simple example, but there's many others that you can pick up from the news all the time where you'll start seeing the kind of gross events. But remember that when we're talking about a breakthrough, according to the ancient philosophy of astrology, we're talking about being able to perceive a subtler and higher level of reality within the world, so that the breakthrough is constituted in terms of the mundane stuff of life becomes a conduit through which you might understand your own higher nature as a soul. The mind can start to perceive in a way that can reflect, start to become a clear mirror in which the soul can see itself. And there can be a sense of being awakened spiritually from a Sun-Uranus square. So that's a sort of higher, sort of esoteric level of things. Now, that breakthrough that you have spiritually could also happen vis-a-vis anything happening in the material world where there is a sudden kind of interruption. So let's talk about what does a breakthrough look like in everyday life. In everyday life, not necessarily even talking about a spiritual breakthrough, but just a regular old breakthrough, a breakthrough means that our ordinary consciousness, our ordinary routine, or ordinary things in life, people, places, things, our nouns maybe, are interrupted, perhaps suddenly, and resulting in some kind of rapid permutation, transformation, or change. And so, but also what often happens is because the normalcy of our life is interrupted, often the normal takes on a sort of temporary numinous quality. So for example, if my wife, who's about to go into labor any day now, if she were to suddenly go into labor, right, my normal routine would be interrupted and would become sort of effulgent. It would become sort of like glowing for a while, and I would perhaps feel a level of anxiety or excitement or creativity or fear, but it would be glowing and pulsing as something rapid disrupts the normal scene. That's a breakthrough. Many of us have these somewhat regularly, and depending on where Uranus is in your chart, you may be someone who can act as a lightning rod and be someone who regularly likes to disrupt other people. That's why, in terms of personal character, Tarnas says that you can embody the wayward, the eccentric, the rebel, the innovator, the disruptor, the trickster. You can be the person who comes in and sort of shocks the whole system. Uranian people can do that, but Uranus can also be like the just sudden disruption of our environment like that. So that's a breakthrough. We all have breakthroughs, right? They happen pretty regularly. But what is the difference between a regular breakthrough and a more profound spiritual breakthrough? Well, I'm going to attempt to define this in some ways, although I'm not any authority, and in some ways I'm not qualified. But as an astrologer, I see this enough to be able to say something about it, I hope. So there's always a temptation when we get a breakthrough in our life. And that temptation is the attempt to immediately try to salvage from the experience some kind of tangible benefit or product for ourselves. So we all do this all the time. We have a breakthrough, and then we immediately say, if we're shocked by the breakthrough, we say, well, it was shocking, but I'm going to make something really good out of this. Or I know that something good will come of this. Or, on the other hand, we might have a breakthrough of insight, a flash of intellectual brilliance, and then say, what can I make of that? Even this talk today, in a sense, demonstrates that kind of hubris, because I had an enlightening conversation with a friend and I thought, what can I make of this? How about my talk for today? Right? So I'm not free of it. We all do this all the time. We look at flashes of insight and we say, what can I do with it? What can I make of it? And the immediate thing is we want to harness. We want to take, grab, hold, make. Right? So the tendency is also, in that sense, to distribute, to disseminate, to want to take something and expand it, to make something out of it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. However, there may be a problem with this. The same thing happens, for example, in astrological transits all the time when we try to interpret the meaning of the transit, or we try to predict what will happen in overly literalistic ways. It's as though we sit and look and look and look and look at the chart until a breakthrough arrives, an image, a concrete prediction, a concrete interpretation, and then blah, we spill it out and we put it out there, and we know that it has enough Shakti or juice behind it that it should land with enough people, and it should be resonant enough that it generates a good response. And that's what we really want, is that good response, because gosh, I need to make money. I need to build my following. I got to get more people on my YouTube channel. Like that. Again, guilty as charged, but this is something that we do. And yet none of this really constitutes a breakthrough, especially when we look at what mystics have told us from all different traditions about what constitutes a real breakthrough. So when we become interested in what we can take from the moment of a breakthrough, what it can give us, what we can make of it, we often are forgetting that what is the most magical, what's the most sensational and amazing, illuminating part is that there was a breakthrough at all, that there is something higher that broke through and spoke, that there is something that delivered an epiphany, that there is an energy that can move in that way in the first place. We miss that because we become enamored by the light of illumination. We become enamored by the effulgence of the divine speaking. And so, what can I do with it? What can I take from it? What can I make of it? And we run off to do things with it. It's beautiful. It's very beautiful. In fact, in the biblical tradition, this is in some ways the embodiment of Lucifer. It's luciferic. It's a light bringer. But Lucifer is a messenger in the original sense, biblically, not the message. He's a messenger who carries a message on behalf of the author. And it's very easy to become enamored of the message, or even the message bearer, right? The one who's delivering the message, and the form it takes and the information it contains, because it's exciting, because it interrupts, because it disrupts, and we want change. Because if truth be told, we're all looking for eternal happiness. We're all looking for eternal love. We're looking for a permanent place to lay our head and rest in a field of sweetness. We're looking for that. Everybody's looking for that. So when something like this comes through and it excites and it enlivens, we often immediately forget that there's a source that it came from, and we get identified with the energy that's coming through, the information that's coming through. And so it becomes, what can I take from it? What can it give to me? What can I make of it? Rather than thinking about, how could I relate to wherever the heck this came from? How could I get to know more of whatever intelligence just broke through and delivered that? Yeah, the intelligence that just came through is amazing. Maybe I will do something with it. But have I even thought to think about where it came from? Or have I even stopped to pause and ask, how do you want me to use this? Whoever is the author of this, please tell me how to use what you just sent through. We don't even think about those things. It's very easy to miss that part of it. So rather than learning how to relate to the source that the breakthrough came from, rather than being curious about where it came from, rather than asking, how may I be of service to you with whatever this is, rather than being interested in keeping the portal open so that we could keep relating to whatever is behind this hit, this lightning flash, we close it up. What can I do with it? What kind of breakthrough can I go and have in the world? And that's selfishness. That's our pride. Let's hear something from James Hillman. James Hillman said something very similar as a psychologist. As a psychologist, James Hillman was frustrated with the tendency of analysts or therapists, psychoanalysts, to try and interpret the meanings of dreams. He felt that the attempt to interpret the meaning of a dream was in some ways inherently disrespectful to the substance and stuff of dreams. It's a similar point made in the realm of psychotherapy. Let's listen to this. This is from a brilliant collection of essays called Animal Presences by James Hillman. Here's what he wrote in a wonderful, lovely, like 3-4-page essay called "A Snake is Not a Symbol." Here's the start of it. He says, often I begin a workshop on animal images with the snake. The snake works like a charm, freeing people of their insidious notions of snake symbolism and therefore of animal symbolism in general. The question I ask sounds like this. How do you understand a snake image? What does a snake mean? What's your interpretation? I have assembled and condensed the replies. Now he lists 12 of them. I'm just going to read some of them. But this is an audience generating their ideas about what a snake in a dream might symbolize. So here's what he says. The snake is renewal and rebirth because it sheds its skin. A snake represents the negative mother because it wraps around, smothers, won't let you go, and swallows whole. It is the animal embodiment of evil. It is sly, shifty, sinister, forked tongue is cursed by God, etc. It's a feminine symbol, having a sympathetic relation with Eve and goddesses in Crete, India, Africa. The snake is a phallus because it stiffens, erects its head, and ejects fluid from its tip. Besides, it penetrates crevices. It represents the material earth world, and as such is a universal enemy of the spirit. The snake is a healer. It is a medicine. It's a guardian of holy men. The snake brings fertility. A snake is death. It's the innermost truth of the body. It's the unconscious libido. So, this is a huge list of things that are being generated. But here's what he says about that. At the end, I'll just skip right to his final point. Once you have translated the great snake into your omnipotence fantasy or penis envy, or you've translated it as a mother symbol, the great mother, you no longer need the image, and you let the image only say one thing in 2 words, great mother. Then it disappears. You don't want that black snake really anymore. You want to work on your mother complex, your personality, and so on. This still leaves the soul unanimated, that is, unalive. The images are not walking around on their own legs. They've been turned into meanings. As Anelia Jaffe wrote about Jung, whose main myth was the myth of meaning, now let's try to leave meaning and the search for meaning and the meaning of life so as to stick with the animal image. In our eagerness for conceptual meanings, we ignore the actual beast. We are no longer astounded by its facts or wonder over its presence that, for instance, a snake dislocates its jaw to swallow an animal larger than itself, that its digestive system works without chewing, without teeth or gizzard or cud, like a rhythmic peristalsis that squeezes its meal against the snake's backbone, crushing its prey into a digestible pulp, or, for instance, the fact that its discarded skin after shedding appears to go on shedding. Lives without meaning hunger for meanings, and psychologists feed the hungry with the living presence of animals. Patients as carnivores, devouring the flesh of their dream animals to satisfy their gluttony for knowledge. Or have we psychologists become taxidermists, disemboweling the snake, stuffing it with concepts, and preserving it as a carefully fixed meaning? So, similarly, right, in astrology, one of the things that we often do when we look at a transit is we go, what does it mean? And we try to interpret it in a way that essentially kills a relationship to it. Similarly, when we have a breakthrough, we say, how can I use this breakthrough? What can I make from it? How will I go and take this moment of inspiration and go and do something in the world with it? And we don't stop to think, how can I cultivate a life, a soulful life, and a mode, a way of being conscious that allows for me to stay in relation with the wellspring of where these flashes of insight are coming from. We don't think about that. So astrology becomes another project in taxidermy, but we're stuffing planets, not animals, right? So planetdermy. But that's the idea, right? Is that you have to be so careful because, yeah, Sun Uranus can be a breakthrough. But what is the real breakthrough here, right? Perhaps do I dare to say it, right? Because who am I? So I'm not above any of these tendencies, but I know that when I'm at my best, when a breakthrough comes of any kind, a flash of insight, of inspiration, a disruption to the status quo, when I'm at my best, I stop and I say, what is behind that? And how can I deepen a relationship to where that's coming from? Not what can I do with this? And I get similarly frustrated in astrology, day in and day out, the dogged pounding of prose that I mentioned earlier, when astrology becomes nothing more than, tossing bones to people who are hungry to say, what's going to happen? What does it mean? And what can I do with it? Something about that is inherently dissatisfying. And so, to my mind, one of the opportunities that I have as an astrologer, even though I will pound the prose, I will talk about what's likely to happen, and I will try to do it in a way that allows for some deeper relating to the source of all of the symbolism, some soulful life that may emerge in the process of all of this. But I'm going to pound the prose, right? But how can I also use my platform, especially in the midst of a crazy week where everyone who's interested in astrology is sort of dead focused on the literalness of what's about to happen, whether it's inner or outer? And maybe I could use my platform for a moment to talk about, let's remind ourselves to get curious about developing a relationship with the unspeakable divinity that is moving in and through these things. Can we become curious about that? Take a little step back in the midst of all of the drama of an intense week of astrology. Okay, so a lot of people in modern practices of astrology suggest that, for example, in order for us to relate to the symbols of astrology, that we need to do away with prediction, because some people fear that predictive astrology is the thing that really kills being able to relate soulfully to what's happening in and through and behind the material realm of events. But I'd like to suggest that it goes beyond that, because the thing is that, so what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Well, mostly the alternative in modern astrology is to focus on the inner life of the psyche, and to suggest that we should look at the birth chart, for example, not so much as describing the outer world, and should stay away from using it to predict things in the outer world, but you should use it to describe the inner world and the different dimensions of who we are as a psychological being. But I'd like to suggest that actually, I don't think we're satisfied in analysis, dissection, description of our inner life either. I don't think that that moves us. I think that that at best teaches us a fascinating language, gives us a kind of mental flexibility, maybe some healthy forms of self-reflection. Those are good things. But I still don't think that that's what really feeds the soul. Because what really feeds the soul is having both your psychology, both your behavior, both your inner life and your outer life, or both at the same time, interrupted by something that wholly splits all of that apart. It splits the nucleus of the sense that you are anything physical, whether it's a behavior or whether it's a dimension of personality or whether it's something happening in the external world. I actually think that in some ways we aren't satisfied with any of that. Ultimately, I think my own personal feeling, just watching clients, observing my own life, is that I think we're all interested in discovering something that we are that is more than this body, more than this temporary psychology, more than this temporary psychological constitution, more than our temporary mental flexibility, more than our temporary material things that we experience. I think we want, in some ways, we relate to all of it as other. And what chance do we have of welcoming the other in a relationship with ourselves if we can't tolerate the other to the point of needing to make everything so subjective that there is no other? So don't predict anything. No objective, no predictive capacity in astrology. It's all just subjective descriptions of your inner subjective life. But if that happens, I really feel that what we're inherently saying is that we're uncomfortable with the otherness. We're uncomfortable with the fact of the matter, which is that we can't escape the fact of the matter. And I believe that astrology, for it to also really offer us a breakthrough, again, going back to where I started the talk, it has to be capable of both accurately describing something about our reality, inner or outer, and it has to do so in an objective way. Because by doing that, it introduces the reality of the other, and it gives us autonomy as a soul. From that standpoint, a real relationship can be forged. The other doesn't have to become dead. It doesn't have to become objectified. You can have an astrologer predict an event in your life that may be difficult, it may be good, it may be, you get a big raise or there's a death in the family. What it actually does when an astrologer has some form of accurate predictive capacity is it opens the gateway for otherness, for those events to be the face of the other. And the face of the other is the face of the beloved. It is the face of the divine. It is a mirror back to ourselves, but it is also an opportunity for a relationship. You can't have that if you try to eliminate relationship by eliminating objectivity. And some people want to do that by eliminating prediction in astrology, and I think it's a mistake. That being said, any kind of overly literalistic predictive methods would also be a mistake, right? So like I said at the beginning, astrologers are constantly charged with the burden of trying to accurately describe something about what's going to happen, and then simultaneously giving people some kind of bridge to relate to the otherness of their own lives with substance and soul. That's not easy, right? So astrology can easily fall back into what my friend said, the dogged pounding of prose. Let's reread that one more time. By the dogged pounding of their prose, it would appear some writers think the absence of poetry makes writing more clear. In the case of technical manuals discussing nuts and bolts and which side faces which, yes. But in the case of sublime and subtle matters, such attempts at unambiguous precision blocks from view the very subtlety trying to be conveyed. All writing is meant to point the eye. Nut and bolt writing points the eye to nuts and bolts. Subtle matters and things sublime must be written of in subtle terms, the role of poetry, where little is conveyed. Artful ambiguity, always a risk, teases us to awaken our senses higher. It's a kind of grace which allows us to perceive what prior we had no prompt to look for. The nature of such writing is pure generosity, all of its expression given away, and its telltale sign is that it simply lets you see for itself. Now, I would dare to say that good astrology, in predicting something of the nuts and bolts of your life, allows you, it points the eye towards something more than the nuts and bolts. That tension between the subtlety and the sublime and the nuts and bolts work together. And so you have to be able as an astrologer to describe something of the nuts and bolts, but convey it in a manner that allows a person to experience the event themselves. I don't think the soul is interested in cheap optimism. I don't think the soul is interested in getting what it wants in the material world. Why? Because all of the things in the material world are constantly changing and they're impermanent. What I think the soul is inherently interested in, what I believe its essential nature is relationships, relational relationships. And so astrology has to have, for it to give you a breakthrough, it has to say something about your life that's descriptive, that's accurate, so that you may relate to that otherness of your own life, the alienation that we feel from our own life every single day. It allows you to encounter it for yourself as a soul. You are not the events of your life. You are not your mind or your body. You are not your thoughts. You are not your feelings, right? But they are yours to experience, right? So they're a gift to you to experience, and not just one of them, not just certain ones that we privilege or we like better than others. Knock on wood that I don't have to go and face something excruciatingly painful, right, in my life. But if I were to, my deepest prayer would be that in the otherness of whatever terror or difficulty may await me, that the same ability to love and be loved would be there. And I believe that. That is the core of my faith, in fact. So astrology itself is a kind of symbolic language. We have to learn how to use astrology to see by means of the entire experience of doing astrology into the divine. C.S. Lewis, for example, one time used this example. He said, perhaps you walk into your backyard and there's a shed in your backyard. You go into the shed, and through the ceiling of the shed, there is a hole, and the sunlight is pouring through it. There's a beam of light coming down through the shed. When you first walk in, you look directly at the light. And then the light is like a light beam. It's like a particular object. But then you walk directly into the beam of light. You look up through it, and through that beam of light, by means of entering into the stream of that beam of light, you see up through the hole in the shed into a higher world, into the sky, etc. So he said that the appropriate use of symbolism is to take a person directly into the beam, so that by seeing by means of and through the symbol, one may see something more clearly. One may see the spiritual world. One may have a fleeting glimpse of divinity. That's the appropriate use of symbol. Now, on the other hand, what is the inappropriate use of symbol? The inappropriate use of symbol is where you're reading a book and you can see sitting there like a heavy rock, oh, this is a symbol. This is a symbol for something else, right? Similarly, when you see that the symbol is just a symbol for something else, it has a kind of mainly an interpretive function. It helps you interpret something. That for Lewis, that was not the appropriate use of a symbol. A symbol should be subtle so that you don't get lost in the symbol, but that the symbol becomes the means by which you see a higher reality. And the symbolist, the writer, and in this case, the astrologer or the reader, has to be able to use symbolism in a way that facilitates pointing the eye toward the sublime, the eye of the reader, the eye of the listener, the eye of the client. That's why I say every single astrological transit has the same inherent potential for breakthrough, because every single astrological transit is the potential light beam that we step into through which to perceive the divine. And what is the divine? Well, it is ever new. It is ever expansive. It is ever knowledgeable. It is ever blissful. You can't capture it. You can't contain it. You can't do something with it, but rather it does something to you. And what it does to you when it really works on you is to change the direction of your heart and soul so that you start to perceive and look toward the divine all the time, in all things, always. It generates devotion. That's the idea. Really relating to what is happening means we allow the event to occur, be it good or bad. We become helpless to the otherness of this world and our lives, and then we rush madly toward the reflection of our soul that we find somewhere in its midst, eager for love, eager for a relationship, and completely unconcerned with whatever may or may not have just happened to us. It's only from this space that we stand to learn anything about our freedom or our flexibility, about happiness or about dignity, about creation or about truth. When both our psychological selves and our bodily, literal selves become open symbols, rocks from which we learn to draw water, then beams of light appear. The spirit of the dove descends, and we begin purifying ourselves. There's a really beautiful image in the Bhakti tradition that suggests that pouring through the spiritual world is the foot of the Lord, and the river Ganges is pouring off from the Lord's feet. And this is one of the reasons that the river Ganges is thought to be a place where you can purify, because it's thought to be a river that's connected directly to that stream that leads us into spiritual life, spiritual reality. Well, this is what astrology is doing. This is what astrology is about. And this is why, to have a real breakthrough, we need to think about astrology differently all the time, as much as we can. When insights like this come for me, when I feel captured by the divine spark or the divine moment, I'm encouraged. And so I'll have to return to the dogged pounding of my prose, right? Pretty soon, like in the next few days, I'll have to keep talking about like what's going to happen and different ways that we might relate to it or whatever. But this is why I believe that we all have to have something in our lives that is teaching us how to use astrology just like you would use chanting or yoga or prayer or anything else. That the use of astrology has to become the means by which we see, not something that keeps encouraging us to look at. So that's what I wanted to share today with everyone. I feel really emotional, just powerful stuff and powerful inner feelings that I'm having also as we're anticipating the birth of a baby and sort of sitting on the edge of this great event and anxiety, and who knows what'll happen. But I'm also feeling very blessed and eager for the experience. So it's kind of generated some of the emotion behind today's talk. So that's what I've got for you all. I'm very thankful to spend this time with you. I hope that this aids you in whatever may come in the next few days with this very powerful eclipse, and sure to be some drama in our lives and in the world. So I'm going to look up and see if there are any questions here. But otherwise, I am very thankful again to have spent time with you all today. All right, that's what I've got. I don't see any questions, so we'll hopefully catch you guys on the flip side. I may do, if the baby isn't here, I may also do something for Eclipse Day, just talking a little bit more basically about the eclipse. So, all right, everybody, hope you have a very beautiful day and take care. Bye.